It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. I would direct your attention to her bio at our program book, but I'd like to introduce her very briefly. Joan Carling is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, based in Baguio City in the north of the Philippines. She is an Indigenous activist from the Cordillera region with more than 20 years of experience working on Indigenous people's rights and issues from the grassroots to the international level. Joan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you. I am honored and privileged to be part of this important media gathering, and I extend my gratitude to the East-West Center for having me here. In September 2018, in the Cordillera region where I come from, a devastating landslide in the mining town of Itogon, Benguet claimed 94 lives and displaced over 700 families as Typhoon Ompong hit northern Luzon in the Philippines. This tragedy is attributed not only to climate change, but also to over a century of corporate mining in indigenous lands, which has removed the natural vegetation and destroyed the soil, thereby increased the risk of landslides. In October 7, 2023, police in central Kalimantan, Indonesia, fatally shot a member of the indigenous Dayak community and critically injured 2 others during a protest against palm oil company. 20 additional community members were arrested in the incident. Palm oil companies have been driving deforestation and grabbing indigenous lands in several countries in Asia, claiming that palm oil is clean, renewable energy. As an indigenous activist and leader, I am here to share facts about indigenous peoples and our experiences and perspectives on climate justice. The 2 cases I have mentioned earlier demonstrate the serious impacts of climate change, as well as the alarming attacks on indigenous peoples when we defend our rights from so-called climate solutions, such as biofuel production. Our ancestors taught us that the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth, and we have our duty to care for it for the future generations. However, the modern narrative of climate action often overlooks this profound connection, leading to policies, programs, and projects that undermine our rights as indigenous peoples, rather than realizing them and supporting us as essential partners in combating climate change. The Asia-Pacific region is the home of two-thirds of the world's indigenous peoples, with more than 300 million of the 466 million. This fact is not very much known, adding to the invisibility of indigenous peoples in Asia. We are facing immense challenges from climate change and climate actions imposed by states and corporations. Indigenous people's simple lifestyles have the least carbon footprint, but we are disproportionately impacted by climate change, further worsening our marginalized condition. As we are heavily tormented by flooding, landslides, droughts, sea level rise, among others, we have the least access to emergency and relief assistance, owing to our geographic location and lack of facilities such as information technology, roads, and health services. This is due to long-term government neglect and persistent discrimination. At the same time, Our lands and resources are being used for climate solutions, such as the energy transition, disregarding our rights and without our meaningful participation in decision-making. Renewable energy projects, while essential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, are not free from human rights violations and is even exacerbating the systemic discrimination of indigenous peoples and social inequity. We support the transition away from fossil fuels to green energy, but it must be done in a way that upholds the dignity and rights of all communities, protect the environment, ensure sustainability, social equity, and accountability. The Conference of Parties, COP28, on climate change last year in Dubai committed to triple the supply of renewable energy by 2050. The two key components of this energy transition with adverse and serious implications to indigenous peoples are, first, the imposition of large dams, solar and windmill farms, geothermal, nuclear, and biofuel plantations for the energy transition. And two, the second is the mining of critical transition minerals needed for renewable technologies such as e-batteries and materials for solar and windmills, disregarding our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, and to our free, prior, and informed consent, to our cultural heritage, and to our self-determined development. Hydropower projects in Nepal, India, Philippines, solar farms in Assam, India, and deforestation of palm oil in Indonesia and Malaysia. These are all examples of renewable energy projects, despite their green promises, have led to significant human rights violations. Displacements, land degradation, destruction of sustainable livelihoods, and loss of biodiversity, food insecurity, and cultural heritage are the cost borne by indigenous communities for the world's pursuit for so-called clean energy. What is more alarming is the anticipated rapid expansion of mining of transition minerals. Almost 70% of known deposits of these minerals, such as nickel, copper, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth, are found within or nearby indigenous territories and local communities. For Asia Pacific, the key transition minerals are nickel, copper, lithium, and rare earth, with 1,524 projects. From our experience, mining is one of the root causes of social and environmental conflicts due to its devastating and often irreversible impacts, not only to the environment, but to our value of living in harmony with nature. This energy transition is anything but just and clean. In Indonesia, for instance, the analysis of 329 nickel mining concessions by the organization called Mighty Earth revealed that these operations have driven up to 1,533 square kilometers of deforestation since 2000. The exploitation of resources, often without the consent of indigenous communities, not only devastates lands, but also threatens our cultural heritage and biodiversity, and lead to criminalizations and attacks on human rights defenders. In the Philippines, mining-affected communities and our allies are regularly subjected to threats, intimidation, red tagging, and trump-up charges with impunity. 4 of my colleagues in the Cordillera are now facing a charge of terrorism because of their defense of indigenous peoples' lands and resources. The Pacific region, with its unique environmental and cultural heritage, is on the front line of climate change impacts, as already presented earlier. Rising sea levels, including temperatures and more frequent and severe storms, are already affecting the lives and livelihoods of Pacific Islanders. The Pacific is rich in minerals essential for renewable energy technologies, such as nickel, cobalt, and lithium. However, the extraction of these minerals often comes with environmental and social costs. Deep sea mining, as presented earlier, for instance, poses significant risks to marine ecosystems and the livelihood of those who depend on the ocean. In the Mekong region, the drive for renewable energy has also led to significant land grabs and environmental injustices. The Mekong River, one of the world's great river systems, supports millions of people in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, and China. However, large-scale hydropower projects along the river have caused widespread displacements and environmental degradation. As large dams are considered as renewable energy, more than 200 new large hydro dams are targeted across Asia in response to the energy transition. This is a major threat to indigenous peoples in the region, as it will be, again, business as usual, ignoring our rights and welfare. In Nepal, the 140 megawatts Tanahud hydropower project funded by the Asia Development Bank is expected to affect nearly 800 households of the Magar indigenous community along the River Seti, with more than 60% of residents losing farmland. They will lose also 2 temples and 9 cremation sites. A survey by the human rights group Community Empowerment and Social Justice Network showed that 3/4 of the residents were not even consulted, and 80% did not receive any compensation. The Paris Agreement commits to respect human rights in all climate actions, yet violations persist and even increasing by the day. National and international climate policies frequently overlook the voices and rights of indigenous communities, leading to solutions that do not consider our unique needs, knowledge, and contributions. In fact, the continuing lack of legal recognition of indigenous peoples as distinct group with collective rights in many countries in Asia is a key factor in the invisibility, criminalization, and wanton violation of our rights. The lands, forests, and agricultural lands of indigenous peoples are regarded normally as empty or unutilized spaces to be used for so-called development projects or under an extractivism economy. The widespread displacement of indigenous peoples is also a result of states refusing to grant legal rights to our lands and resources. In 2016, a Malaysian federal court ruled that the Dayak people of Sarawak, Malaysia, cannot rely on their native customary rights to claim title over virgin forest as their territorial domains and communal forest reserves. Similarly, in Myanmar, the vacant fallow and virgin land management law denies land rights to many people for communal and customary uses of some land by classifying them as vacant, allowing the state to take possession of it. In fact, the trend now is to weaken laws recognizing our land rights where it exists and to enforce laws and policies that are criminalizing the exercise of indigenous peoples to manage our lands and resources through our sustainable livelihood practices. In Cambodia, indigenous peoples are being criminalized for violating laws on protected areas and wildlife sanctuaries when practicing their sustainable livelihoods, such as rotational agriculture. As of April 22, there were at least 95 known court cases of unjust detention with majority women, indigenous women, who have made invaluable contributions in protecting land and environment. Despite these challenges, indigenous peoples are not passive victims of climate change and government policies. Across the Asia-Pacific region, indigenous peoples are actively working to strengthen their resilience and create sustainable community-based solutions. In Indonesia, the Dayak people have implemented community-based forest management practices that combine traditional knowledge with modern conservation techniques. These efforts have led to the restoration of degraded lands and the protection of biodiversity, while also enhancing communities' capacity to withstand climate impacts. Community-based renewable energy projects managed by indigenous peoples are also gaining momentum in several countries in Asia. Microhydro, solar energy, biogas, managed by communities, have been empowering indigenous women as it lightened their heavy workload in many ways. Indigenous communities possess invaluable traditional knowledge about sustainable and resource management, which is key in strengthening their resilience. Integrating this knowledge into climate strategies can enhance the effectiveness of our actions and ensure more sustainable and equitable outcomes. However, this knowledge is often undervalued or ignored in favor of Western scientific approaches. As Asian governments and corporations fast-track renewable energy projects and biodiversity conservation plans, land grabbing, environmental destruction, eviction, food insecurity, pollution, and destruction of water bodies and loss of biodiversity will escalate. Indigenous peoples will continue to assert and defend our rights, facing attacks, threats, intimidation, arrest, detention, and even killings. The rise of authoritarian and corporate-friendly governments in Indonesia and India exacerbates these threats. The world's shift to mineral-based energy economy cannot come at the expense of indigenous peoples. We must demand transparency and accountability in supply chains, ensuring that every transition respects indigenous peoples' rights, including obtaining free, prior, and informed consent for projects on our lands and ensuring sustainability and social equity. Further, the exclusion of indigenous peoples and marginalized sectors from decision-making processes must end to achieve a truly just transition. The worsening attacks on environment defenders and indigenous peoples defending our rights require solidarity and action from those who care for the planet, for human rights, and social justice. I extend my warmest solidarity greetings and acknowledgement to all journalists and media practitioners facing risks and threats for amplifying our voices and speaking truth to power. We share a common aspiration in pursuing accountability for those misusing their power and twisting facts to meet their vested interests at the expense of the marginalized. Media support is crucial in changing the narratives of governments in Asia, that deny our distinct identities to justify violating our rights with impunity. Governments often claim that we are all indigenous, as in the case of Indonesia and India, or that we do not have indigenous peoples, only ethnic minorities or hill tribes, to deny our collective rights. This narrative must be countered consistently, covering the stories of these so-called cultural minorities as indigenous peoples, highlighting the disregard to our rights and aspirations. By doing so, media can dismantle misleading government narratives and expose the truth about the existence, the rights, and struggles of indigenous peoples. Another harmful narrative is that indigenous peoples are backward and anti-development because we oppose commercial mining, energy projects, agribusiness, which are often presented as necessary to combat climate change or for national economic growth. This misinformation is used to trample our rights to our lands and resources, demonizing and attacking us. Media plays a critical role in presenting the facts and perspectives of indigenous peoples. To counter these misleading distortions, journalists can investigate and report on the true impacts of these projects, giving voice to affected communities and challenging the portrayal of indigenous resistance as anti-progress. To support indigenous peoples effectively, the media can further amplify our voices and stories. This includes providing platforms for indigenous leaders, activists, and communities to share our experiences, knowledge, and solutions. By highlighting our resilience and contributions, journalists can help shift the public perception from viewing indigenous peoples as victims to recognizing us as active agents of change. This can foster greater understanding and empathy among the broader public, building support for indigenous rights and initiatives. Journalists can also play a crucial role by conducting more in-depth investigative reporting on the abuses and injustices faced by indigenous peoples in the name of climate action. This includes uncovering land grabs, forced eviction, environment degradation, human rights violations perpetrated by corporations and state authorities. Through thorough and unbiased reporting, the media can bring these issues to light, holding those responsible to account and prompting actions from both national and international communities. By fostering solidarity between indigenous environment defenders and media practitioners, we can create a stronger voice in the fight for climate justice. We can both advance the call for press freedom and the protection of journalists through joint solidarity actions. The future we envision is where we can continue to live in harmony with nature and our rights, knowledge, and contributions as indigenous peoples are recognized and respected. It is a future where climate action is inclusive, equitable, truly just, and sustainable for the present and future generations. In conclusion, I call upon each of you to join us in the fight to expose unjust climate actions. Let us work together to demand that those destroying the planet are held to account. By fostering solidarity between indigenous environment defenders and media practitioners, we can strengthen our fight for climate justice, protection of the environment, and upholding human rights. We need to heed this call of our time to contribute in saving the only planet we all depend on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan, for that really moving and powerful keynote. I think it is filled with so much insight and experience and perspectives that all of us here in the room would really benefit from. Joanne essentially provided us with a roadmap in understanding the role of Indigenous peoples in our fight towards climate action and ensuring that no one gets left behind. Joanne, I'm thinking of some of the lines that you have mentioned in your speech, and I think one of the key things that struck out to me was how important it is that we look into the intersections of not just climate and environment, but how it is intertwined with, human rights, with Indigenous rights. But the reality that you've mentioned is that for many regions in the country, these Indigenous voices are being sidelined, and as you said, even made invisible. I'm curious to hear about your current outlook on the inclusion of Indigenous voices in climate adaptation and mitigation strategies, I think particularly in Asia and the Pacific. Do you see a more positive trend now that we are heading towards COP29 in Azerbaijan in November in the actual meaningful participation of Indigenous voices?
The participation of Indigenous peoples in climate mitigation and adaptation strategies very much depend on the approach or attitude of governments to their Indigenous peoples. There are in some countries even include Indigenous delegation in the negotiations. They are there. But when we talk of meaningful participation, what we mean is that our perspective and our rights and aspirations are also integrated in the strategies. And that means, for example, in climate adaptation, our Indigenous knowledge is very critical, because we have proven this with the resilience of Indigenous peoples. And if we look at the biodiversity, the remaining biodiversity of the world now, 80% are in Indigenous territories, which we have protected. And data also shows that biodiversity in Indigenous territories are much better conserved than those that are managed by others. This is a clear indication that we are actually providing solutions to climate change, but we are not there. And now, even in the climate change platform, there is the Indigenous Knowledge Platform. But the problem there is that it's again a form of extractivism, that people want to use our traditional knowledge, but not respecting our rights. So they can use our knowledge, but they can still grab our lands. They can still displace us in the name of conservation. So we cannot isolate the issue of rights and knowledge when it comes to making sure that we are part of the decisions and strategies in relation to climate change.
You highlighted, Joan, in your keynote earlier, how important it is that there is legal recognition and protection of Indigenous lands and resources. But you've also talked about many of these laws being weakened in the Philippines, in many parts of Asia. How critical is this recognition in combating climate change?
Yeah, okay, let me give you another fact again. 25% of the world's landmass is claimed by Indigenous peoples as our customary land. But only 10% of this has legal recognition, meaning the rest is vulnerable to land grabbing and resource grab by states and others, because we don't have the legal protection. And when I was talking about the transition a while ago, this means the minerals for the just transition will be taken. And that would mean more environmental destruction, more poverty, more insecurity, food insecurity. That would be the result. So if you look at the other side, if it is protected, then we can continue to protect the remaining forest, which is critical for climate because of its capacity for carbon sequestration. The same with oceans. We will be able to protect better the oceans because we have these reciprocal relations with our environment. So that will continue, and if we have control, then companies cannot just come and take away these lands and resources. And we will be able to protect biodiversity, we will be able to produce more food for food security, we will be able to preserve our cultural heritage, we will be able to continue providing cultural diversity to the world, we will be able to enhance our traditional knowledge, which is critical in building resilience. So these are the important contributions that we can make if our land rights are recognized and protected.
You were talking earlier also about the role that media plays in this entire conversation. And of course, we want to take this opportunity to hear from you and have kind of sort of a wake-up call on what we can also do better. You've highlighted some of the few things that we can do, but I'm also personally curious to hear about where do you think at the moment journalists and the media kind of fall short in the coverage of Indigenous rights and Indigenous communities?
That's a very good question. But before I respond to that, may I know if there are there Indigenous journalists in the room? Can you raise your hands, please?
One here, I think this is.
Okay, I see two. Are there journalists here in the room that have covered Indigenous issues? Okay, I see a handful. Okay, yeah, that somehow also demonstrates the lack of coverage of I call it an existential issue for our survival if these false solutions to climate change will persist, right? And that is, I think, what needs to be covered by media in terms of how serious the impacts of these so-called solutions to Indigenous peoples. That's one. One is the narrative. We are presenting a different pathway, a different solution. We are presenting the kind of principles and values that we do as a people, that our reciprocal relations with nature, upholding the common good, being accountable with each other, having strong solidarity, and caring for each other. These are the values that we have, that makes us resilient, that makes us more coherent, cohesive as communities. But these are not highlighted as real principles and policies that can guide how we deal with the problem that we are facing now. We're saying climate change is the result of the years of industrialization. Yet, we are still following that trajectory instead of transforming our economy and political system that will make sure that the remaining resources is going to be used for the people and the environment. So I think for journalists, it's really filling the gap and connecting the dots. That's what I mean, connecting the dots to provide a more holistic view on how are we going to tackle this existential crisis by also amplifying the voices, not only of Indigenous peoples, but other marginalized communities who are suffering and yet are actually providing the real solutions to climate change. There's so many out there, but they are just invisible.
So many good points there, Joan. I think one of the key things also that I am taking away from our conversation is, when you highlighted the importance of actual meaningful participation, so that voices of indigenous communities are not simply like tokens, right? Or like, a case study or a source, but actual experiences, actual perspectives and knowledge that must be included in that very important conversation. And while, we are talking here, we are also considering the many overlaps of the experiences of indigenous environmental defenders and journalists. You mentioned earlier that indigenous environmental defenders face a lot of threats, intimidation. It's very also apparent here in the Philippines with our terrorism laws. But journalists, and I know many are also experiencing this, many in the room also face these threats. Do you have insights as to how indigenous peoples and journalists can kind of work together to be able to protect and uphold, our common rights?
Yeah, that's one of the real challenge that we face. The once we challenge power and speak truth to power, we are put in a risky situation. And I have a lot of journalist friends who are facing the same. And I think it's important to maintain the solidarity relations of indigenous environment defenders, human rights defenders, and journalists. And that means that we need to have an effective communication channel so that we can also give warning to each other, but also develop networks among lawyers lawyers, so that we can then mobilize them in case of any form of attacks, but also use the power of media to expose these kind of threats and attacks. We have cases in the region, or I can even cite the case when more than 600 human rights advocates, including journalists, indigenous activists, including myself, were charged with terrorism in the Philippines. And a lot of media came out and expressed their solidarity to all those that were, including their colleagues that were also mentioned in that list. And eventually, of course, with the other actions, that list was removed, or the case was dropped after several actions taken also by indigenous peoples, journalists, human rights lawyers, and others. And I think that expression of solidarity and joint action is really critical for us.
I'm coming up to my last question here, so if there are questions from the room, you may queue at the microphone in the middle. Joan, this has been such a powerful keynote and a really important conversation that we are having. And you've mentioned the importance of solidarity between indigenous peoples and journalists. I guess if there is one key thing that you want our participants to also kind of take away from all of the insights you've shared, what would that might be?
I think journalists have some power in their hands in amplifying the voices of indigenous peoples and marginalized groups. And I hope you can use that power to make those that are accountable held in terms of human rights violations and destroying our environment, be held accountable by telling the truth, by presenting the voices of those that are not only suffering, but are also are actors of change.
Thank you, Joan. We'll take our first question.
So, you have spoken eloquently and convincingly about the importance of indigenous rights relative to the land. I'd love to hear your comments about an approach to Indigenous voices, rights, and responsibilities for the ocean, especially among the people who live on islands in the Pacific. Nainoa Thompson, who opened this section of the conference, is about to launch the Moana Nui Akea voyage of the Hokulea to unite the people of the Pacific for ocean care, as well as to restore and respect the traditional wisdom, the knowledge of the people across the Pacific and around the world, those who have the depth of knowledge that comes from living and making peace with a place over a long time. Presently, it's not just the fact that island countries are small land, big ocean, but the high seas beyond is part of what is their heritage, their country, the source of their life, as well as livelihoods.
Yes.
And right now, there are 5 countries that are disproportionately extracting life from the high seas.
Yeah.
And everyone around the world, especially the island cultures, are paying the cost of the industrial extraction of life, now poised also to go deep and industrial extract minerals from the deep sea. I'd love your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I actually mentioned the deep sea mining, but I just want to emphasize that from Indigenous perspective, we all come from different ecosystems, including the oceans, mountains, forests, seas, savannas. We are all united, and we definitely are one in solidarity with all our Indigenous brothers and sisters in islands and those that are depending on oceans. And we all believe in the value and principle of our reciprocal relations with nature, whether you're relying on the ocean, the rivers, the forests, the mountains. We are all the same in that regard. And we do express our strong solidarity with our Pacific brothers and sisters and those in the Caribbean as well who are affected, and also those in the Arctic. So in the global Indigenous movement, we are all together in advancing the protection of all these ecosystems.
Thank you, Joan. You mentioned that the ADB, the Asia Development Bank, was the lender for a project which resulted in environmental destruction. In your view, in your experience, are the big international lenders paying close enough attention to the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and also to the environmental impact?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I've been engaging with the World Bank and also the EIB and the Asia Development Bank, and now they are positioning themselves as the source of funds for climate action. Right? They want to position themselves to get all the funds for climate action. But the problem is the way they have their safeguards, environmental and social safeguards. The good thing is they have this in place. But the one in dealing with Indigenous peoples is especially in relation to the requirement for our free, prior, and informed consent on projects that affects us is still very weak in terms of implementation. In fact, there are cases that are, like for example, in Africa, World Bank suddenly stopped the funding in Tanzania because the Maasai have demonstrated that and called their attention because they are being evicted in the name of conservation. So, and World Bank was giving the government funds for conservation, but conservation cannot lead to eviction, right? To violation of rights of Indigenous peoples. So there is a problem in the implementation of their safeguards. And we are very much concerned that if they do not rectify the way they are implementing their safeguards and ensure that there is meaningful engagement and the participation in decision-making of indigenous peoples, the projects that I have mentioned will again get the support of these multilateral finance agencies that will continue to violate our rights. So we hope that you also monitor the projects and impacts of these multilateral financing institutions, because they do a lot of damage. And I hope that they will now segue to better ways of protecting the environment and respecting human rights.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope I answered that. Yeah.
Hi there. My name is Regina. I'm with One News, which is a cable channel here in the Philippines. Talking about harmful narratives, you're absolutely right. It does feel like every couple of years or so, a narrative will pop up that's seemingly being pushed by the energy industry. And the one that I'm hearing right now is that LNG is the perfect transition fuel, right? And by the way, that's not just in the Philippines, that's across Southeast Asia. It's perfect transition fuel because it's much cleaner and it's much more reliable, but end of the day, it is still a fossil fuel. So, and in fact, just this week, I was invited to a forum with the title, Fueling Sustainable Progress Through LNG, Liquefied Natural Gas. Could you share your experience on it, what you know of it, and how it's impacted indigenous communities, please?
Okay. I'm more familiar with the other forms of mining and gas, but nevertheless, what we need to know is how are these LNG being extracted? Where? Are they from indigenous territories, and what has been the environmental impact of this kind of mining or extraction of oil? Because and also its impact to the environment, because it's still considered as part of the fossil fuel, right? Which has this the carbon emission is still what we need to reduce. So. And I think it's really being marketed heavily. No, this is heavily marketed as sort of alternative, but the effect is the same. So what we need to do is look for other options for those kind of energy needs of communities. And there are already proven other options like biogas or community-based solar or community-based renewable microhydro projects. These are the ones that actually work on the ground if only these are supported. And look at the subsidy, for example, going to fossil fuel. These are heavily subsidized by the rich countries. They are in trillions. So if that money is used to support community-based renewable energy and not LPG, then you can imagine that it is more sustainable in the long run, and community have a better sense of ownership because it's in their hands. They can control this form of energy that they can use instead of using LPG, which is highly dictated by the market and the commercial, and again, does not provide the solution for the transition that we need to make. So,
thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Joan. We have time for one brief question. Go ahead, please.
Okay, hello. My name's Nai. I have a question about how can I explain as people I found indigenous people situation human zoo is violence for human rights. How can I explain as people?
okay, if I gather your question, how can you explain the rights of indigenous peoples, particularly to free, prior, and informed consent, I think, there, and participation in decision making. Yeah, so let me backtrack in history, right? Before states were formed, we as indigenous peoples already exist. We have our governing bodies, we have our cultures, we have the way to manage lands and resources and other ecosystems. We are managing it even before states were formed. When states were formed, they disenfranchised us. We were pushed on the side. And our system, our governance system, our cultures were not taken on board. And so that's why we demanded that in order for us to continue to exist, we need our resources, we need our culture, because we were there in the first place before the imposition of states, right? And that is the basis of why we can only continue to survive and exist as indigenous peoples if we still have rights over our lands, territories, and resources. So if anyone wants to make use of where our identities, our cultures are based on, they need to ask our permission. It's like if you own a house and somebody comes in and wants to take your furnitures that you own, do you have the right to decide if they can take it or not? That's the comparison to us. Does that make sense?
All right, thank you so much, Joan. I think that wraps up our conversation. We would love to entertain more questions, but unfortunately we are running out of minutes here. But Joan will be here. I'm sure she will be more than happy to speak with our journalists here in the room. Joan, once again, thank you so much for this discussion.